This is Alan Rouse. If anyone can hear me, we're trapped near the summit. Those were the final words ever heard from one of Britain's greatest mountaineers, a man whose courage outlasted his luck, and whose name became forever tied to the deadliest mountain on Earth, K2. It was the summer of 1986, the year K2 earned its darkest nickname, the Savage Mountain. That season, 13 climbers would never come back down. But among all those who perished, one story stood out, a man whose dream was bigger than his fear, and whose death still echoes through every storm that sweeps across that mountain. Alan Rouse was not just another climber chasing glory, he was the leader, the one everyone looked to when the mountain turned violent. But when the storm came, leadership turned into a curse. Trapped near the top, freezing, starving, and watching his teammates slip away one by one, Alan made a decision that defined what it truly means to face death with dignity. They say courage isn't found on the summit. It's found in the moments when you know you're not coming home. In this episode, we'll unravel the haunting final climb of Alan Rouse, the man remembered as the symbol of the British spirit on K2. Stay with us until the end of this story, because what happened in those last hours at 8,200 meters will make you question what heroism really means. This is K2 Stories, where every climb ends with a story. Before Alan Rouse ever touched the icy flanks of K2, he was already known in British climbing circles as a prodigy. Not because he was the strongest or the boldest, but because he was relentless. Born in 1951 in Wallasey, England, Alan didn't come from the kind of family that produced adventurers. He wasn't born into privilege or pedigree. He was born with something rarer, a defiance against limitation. From the moment he discovered the cliffs of North Wales as a young man, he found a language that only mountains could speak, a silent dialogue between courage and consequence. At university, his friends remembered him as someone who could turn a casual hike into an expedition. He was witty, magnetic, and fearless, the kind of man who'd make a risky move on a vertical wall just to prove that it could be done. And soon, his name began to ripple through the British climbing scene. Not as a daredevil, but as a pioneer. By his late 20s, Alan had already climbed in the Alps, Patagonia, and the Himalayas. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing purity. A real climb, he once told a friend, isn't about getting to the top. It's about finding out who you are when everything is stripped away. But behind his confident grin, there was an unspoken frustration. Britain had produced legends on Everest, names like Mallory, Hillary, Bonington, yet K2, the second highest peak in the world, remained unconquered by a British-led team. To Alan, that was a wound in the pride of his nation, and he wanted to be the one to heal it. In the 1980s, K2 was known among mountaineers as the Mountain of Mountains. Steeper than Everest, colder than Makalu, and crueler than any other summit on Earth. For every 4 climbers who reached the top, 1 would die trying. But to men like Rouse, those odds weren't warnings. They were invitations. Alan had spent years preparing for his chance. In 1983, he led a British team to the unclimbed west face of K2, but the weather destroyed their effort. Frostbite, exhaustion, and defeat forced them back. Yet even in failure, Rouse felt something awaken in him. "I've seen what the mountain can do," he wrote later, "and I know I'll return. It's unfinished business." When 1986 arrived, Alan was 35 years old, at the peak of his ability and reputation. But he wasn't just planning another climb. He was planning redemption. The goal, a small independent British expedition that would reach the summit without bottled oxygen or fixed ropes, pure alpine style, the way true mountaineers believed it should be done. That year, K2 was unusually crowded. Teams from around the world, Poles, Austrians, Italians, Americans, Mexicans, all converged on the mountain, each hoping to make history. The air at base camp was electric, buzzing with ambition and anxiety. It was a gathering of the world's best and most stubborn climbers. Alan quickly became a central figure in that chaos. His leadership, humor, and charm drew others to him. He was pragmatic, yet inspiring. The man who could break tension with a joke even as a storm brewed above. But inside, he carried the weight of expectation. He knew what the press back home expected. Britain's great return to the top of the world. In his journal, found years later, he scribbled a single line that read, "If we make it, it's glory. If we don't, maybe it's still worth it." To Rouse, K2 wasn't a peak, it was a question. Could the human will still stand when nature stripped it bare? Could he prove that courage wasn't about luck, but about facing the inevitable with grace? His friends would later say that Alan had changed before that final expedition. He wasn't reckless anymore. He was deliberate. Like a man who'd already accepted that some dreams demand everything, even life itself. As he packed his gear that spring, he paused to look at a photograph on his desk, a picture of his young daughter. He tucked it into his jacket pocket, zipped it up, and smiled. He had promised her he'd come back. But deep down, he knew promises and mountains rarely agree. And so, with quiet determination, he boarded the plane for Pakistan, not knowing that he was walking into one of the deadliest summers K2 would ever see. "You don't conquer K2, Alan once said. You negotiate with it, and sometimes the mountain doesn't sign the deal." Before K2, there were years of preparation, years that would test Alan Rouse's endurance, humility, and resolve. To outsiders, climbing was just a sport, but to Alan, it was a lifelong dialogue with fear. Every peak was a question, every fall, a lesson written in ice and pain. By the early 1980s, Alan had already survived avalanches, frostbite, and near-death storms in the Alps and Himalayas. He trained not in gyms or fancy facilities, but on rock walls in the biting wind, where his fingers cracked and bled against the stone. His mornings began before dawn, running through fog and rain, a pack of stones strapped to his back to mimic the weight of climbing gear. When asked once why he put himself through such torture, he laughed. Because when you're dying up there, you don't want to realize you trained too little. Alan wasn't a man who sought shortcuts. He was obsessed with purity, climbing without supplemental oxygen, without fixed ropes, without the safety nets that made modern expeditions feel tame. To him, true alpinism meant earning every breath. But that philosophy came at a price. Sponsors didn't line up for purists. Funding was scarce. Many in the British climbing community admired his skill, but questioned his practicality. Why risk everything for a style of climbing that only a few understood? Alan's answer was simple. Because the mountain deserves honesty. That belief forged his identity and isolated him. His relationships grew strained, his personal life complicated. Friends said that when he wasn't on a mountain, he seemed misplaced, restless, distracted, half alive. His mind was already on the next climb. By 1985, Alan was training for K2 with surgical precision. Every movement, every calorie, every step in the snow was part of a plan to make the climb in alpine style, light, fast, and clean. No porters above base camp, no oxygen, no fixed lines, just skill, stamina, and nerve. It wasn't just physical preparation. Alan studied weather patterns, mapped out potential routes, and analyzed the failures of previous expeditions. He had read the journals of those who had died on K2, and underlined their mistakes in red ink. But there's a cruel irony to mountains. No matter how much you prepare, they always rewrite the rules. That spring, Pakistan's Karakoram range was colder and more unpredictable than usual. Massive icefalls shifted overnight. Winds reached hurricane speeds. Climbers whispered that K2 was awake that year, angry, unpredictable, unkind. Still, Alan pressed forward. He assembled a small team, skilled, diverse, independent-minded. Unlike national expeditions with heavy logistics and strict hierarchies, Rouse's group would rely on agility and trust. He wanted climbers who could think, not just follow. Among them were British, Polish, and Austrian mountaineers, strangers united by obsession. Yet, as experienced as they were, tension brewed early. Different nationalities, different philosophies, different egos, and Alan, though respected, wasn't always diplomatic. His intensity could be inspiring or intimidating, depending on who you asked. One climber later said, "You either loved being around Alan, or you couldn't stand it, but you never ignored him. He trained his team relentlessly at base camp, running drills, testing ropes, studying avalanche paths. He spoke little about fear, but he understood it deeply. When a young climber once confessed his anxiety, Alan replied, "Fear's good. It keeps you alert. Just don't let it climb first." Behind his confidence, though, something darker simmered. He was aware of how fine the line was between bravery and fatalism. Friends back home noticed it too. He'd talk less about making it to the top, and more about how far we can go before the mountain stops us. There was another factor, the unspoken competition. 1986 had become a year of record ambitions on K2. Multiple teams, all racing for the summit, all trying to outdo one another. Radio chatter buzzed with plans and camps grew crowded. The pressure was on. Reputations, sponsorships, even national pride hung in the balance. But Alan didn't care about flags or fame. His goal was personal, almost philosophical. He wanted to prove that a small, pure expedition could succeed where larger, well-funded ones had failed. As the days passed, climbers watched in awe as Rouse's group ascended higher than expected, establishing advanced camps under brutal weather. His leadership showed calm precision, every risk measured, every decision deliberate. Then came the law of the mountain. Above 8,000 meters, the death zone, the human body begins to die. Every breath burns, every heartbeat weakens. No rescue is possible. Up there, rules change. Even friendship becomes fragile. Alan knew this law well. He had seen men become ghosts in that thin air, their judgment fading with oxygen. Still, he refused to turn back when conditions worsened. "The window's closing," he said. "If we wait, the mountain wins." Those words, spoken with conviction, would echo later, like prophecy. In every climber's life, there comes a moment when preparation ends and surrender begins. For Alan Rouse, that moment was near. The years of training, the pain, the belief, all of it was about to meet the cold, brutal truth of K2. And as he tightened his harness and looked up at the sheer white face above him, he smiled faintly, not in arrogance, but in recognition. The mountain was ready, and so was he. The morning of July 31st, 1986, dawned sharp and blue above K2. The summit gleamed like a blade, so close, yet impossibly far. For Alan Rouse and the climbers around him, this was it, the final push. After weeks of storms, injuries, and dwindling supplies, the weather had finally opened a narrow window, maybe 2 days, maybe less. And when K2 offers you a chance, you take it. The group that gathered for the summit attempt wasn't a single team anymore. The mountain had forced alliances. Climbers from Britain, Poland, Austria, and Mexico had merged into one desperate improvised unit, a coalition born of exhaustion and hope. Alan was now the de facto leader, not because he demanded it, but because everyone instinctively looked to him when decisions turned deadly. At Camp 4, perched at 8,000 meters, the air was so thin that every breath felt like inhaling through a straw. The tents rattled like paper in the wind. Alan sat outside, watching the sunset stain the snow in crimson and gold. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "It's beautiful, and it wants us gone." The climb to the summit would begin at midnight. They packed light, a few energy bars, water, ropes, and the fading warmth of determination. Oxygen tanks were left behind. Alan refused them. "If we use O2, it's not the same mountain," he said. His purest code, once a matter of pride, would soon become a matter of life and death. The ascent was grueling from the start. The slope beyond the shoulder, the final approach to the summit pyramid, was an endless field of blue ice and powder snow. Every step sank, every anchor slipped. The climbers moved slowly, each one tied to the next by a thin rope that might save or kill them. The higher they climbed, the more surreal it became. Above 8,200 meters, clouds rolled beneath their boots, and the horizon curved like the edge of the world. The silence was absolute, broken only by labored breathing and the distant groan of avalanches. Alan led the line for hours, setting anchors, checking the path. His movements were efficient, almost mechanical, years of discipline unfolding in rhythm. Behind him, the Polish climber Dobrosława Miodowicz-Wolf, known as Doba, stumbled, her pace faltering. Alan turned back and reached for her arm. "Steady, just keep moving." The compassion was brief but human, a flicker of warmth in a frozen world. By late morning, the summit loomed above them, only a few hundred meters away. The air shimmered in the sunlight, and the wind howled through their hoods. The final ridge was knife-thin, with a 1,000-meter drop on either side. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. At 1:30 p.m., Alan reached the top. He didn't raise his arms or shout in victory. He simply stood, breathing hard, eyes closed against the sting of snow. Around him the world was endless. The Karakoram range stretching in every direction, a jagged sea of white and stone. Others followed soon after. The Poles, the Austrians, the Mexicans. They hugged weakly, snapped a few photos, and exchanged smiles that looked more like grimaces. They had done it, but none of them knew that reaching the summit was the beginning of their end. By the time they started descending, the weather had turned. Clouds swept in fast from the west, black and angry. The wind picked up, tearing at their gear. Snow began to fall, thick and blinding. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Alan shouted through the storm, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. One by one, the climbers became silhouettes, then ghosts. The descent turned chaotic. Ropes tangled, anchors failed. The slope vanished under avalanching powder. Then came the storm. Winds reached over 100 kilometers per hour. Temperatures plummeted below 40 degrees Celsius. Their tents at Camp 4 were half buried in snow. The climbers crawled inside, shivering, dehydrated, hallucinating. Some had frostbite so severe that their fingers turned black. For 2 days, they waited for a break in the storm. For 2 nights, they listened to the mountain scream. Alan tried to maintain morale. He melted snow for water, rationed food, checked on each person, and kept the radio alive with short, clipped updates. Still here, still waiting, no visibility. But by the 3rd day, his voice weakened. Supplies were gone. The oxygen in their blood was running out. Desperation began to fracture the group. Some wanted to move down, others to wait. Alan faced the hardest decision of his life: risk death in descent, or freeze waiting for a miracle. He looked out into the white void and said quietly, "If this is where it ends, let's make it count." The storm raged on, and somewhere beneath that suffocating blizzard, the man who once symbolized the British spirit stood against the final test, not of strength, but of endurance. In the death zone, heroism doesn't roar. It whispers. This is Alan Rouse. If anyone can hear me, we're still here. Trapped. No food. No visibility. Those words drifted through the radios at K2 base camp, broken, fading, carried by a storm that refused to die. It was August 3rd, 1986. For nearly a week, the climbers had been stranded at 8,200 meters, caught in the death grip of a storm that swallowed everything in snow and silence. At Camp 4, the small multinational group was disintegrating, physically and mentally. Alan Rouse, once the image of strength and composure, was now gaunt, hollow-eyed, his lips cracked and bleeding. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Frostbite crept up his hands and feet. Inside the tent, bodies lay huddled like shadows, each fighting their own battle against the mountain and against time. Food was gone. Their last stove had stopped working. They melted snow by holding it in their mouths, a slow, torturous ritual to buy another hour of life. When the wind tore through the tent walls, Alan used his own jacket to patch the holes. Every movement was agony. Still, he refused to panic. He kept taking head counts, kept talking, kept trying to plan an escape route. But deep down, even he knew the truth. There was no way down anymore. The ropes were buried, the ice was breaking, and the storm was endless. One climber, the Polish mountaineer Dobrosława Miodowicz-Wolf, slipped into unconsciousness, Another, Austrian Willi Bauer, begged for help descending alone. Alan insisted they wait, that the weather would ease, but waiting meant dying. By August 4th, a fragile silence fell outside. The wind slowed, the snow softened. The survivors saw a thin line of sunlight cut through the fog, a false hope. Two of the climbers decided to risk the descent. They tied themselves to the rope and disappeared into the white abyss. Alan watched them go. He didn't follow. His body was too weak, his mind too fogged by altitude and dehydration. Every breath was a fight. He sat near the tent's entrance, staring out at the ghostly slope that had once promised glory. The radio crackled again, faint voices from base camp trying to reach them. Alan managed one final transmission. "We'll try. To come down. Tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. That night, the storm returned, worse than before. Snow piled over the tent, collapsing the thin nylon walls. Alan and the few remaining climbers huddled together, wrapped in the remnants of their sleeping bags. The sound of the wind became a roar, drowning everything, even prayer. One by one, their voices faded. When rescuers finally reached Camp 4 weeks later, they found only remnants of what had once been a group of the world's finest climbers. Bodies lay frozen in their final positions, as if time itself had stopped. Some had died sitting upright, eyes still open. Alan's body was among them near the edge of the tent, facing outward, as if he had been watching for one last glimpse of dawn. The world below had already begun to grieve. News spread fast. British climber Alan Rouse presumed dead on K2. The headlines echoed across London, Manchester, and Liverpool. To the climbing community, it was a devastating loss, the end of an era defined by bold, uncompromising adventure. But Alan's story didn't fade with the snow. His name became legend, the British spirit on K2. Not because he conquered the summit, but because he faced defeat with courage and composure few could imagine. In the weeks that followed, debates erupted. Some criticized his decisions. Why didn't he turn back earlier? Why refuse oxygen? Why take such risks when the storm was clearly closing in? Others defended him fiercely. Alan didn't die chasing fame, one friend said. He died doing what he loved and doing it honestly. Perhaps both were true. Mountains, after all, are mirrors. They show us who we are. And in Alan's reflection, people saw something raw, something timeless. The unyielding human need to reach for something higher, even when it costs everything. Years later, in 1992, climbers passing the shoulder of K2 spotted a lone shape half buried in snow. A body preserved by ice, still tethered to the slope. They didn't disturb it. They whispered a quiet farewell and moved on. That body, they believed, was Alan Rouse, still watching over the mountain that claimed him. K2 never gives back what it takes, but sometimes it leaves a story behind. When the storm finally cleared, K2 stood silent, the same as it had always been, unmoved, unchanged. Only the human traces had vanished, swallowed by snow and time. Alan Rouse's death marked more than just the loss of a brilliant climber. It marked the end of an age, the final breath of pure idealistic mountaineering before commercial expeditions, satellite weather, and GPS safety nets changed everything. Back in Britain, newspapers called him the last romantic of the mountains. His friends described him differently. He wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing truth. Because to Alan, K2 wasn't a conquest. It was a question that only few ever dared to answer. What are you willing to give for something greater than yourself? He didn't survive, but his story did, whispered among climbers at base camps across the Himalayas, retold every time another storm rolled in. His name became part of the Mountain S legend, alongside those who vanished before and after him. To this day, his final climb remains one of the most haunting chapters in mountaineering history. A man who reached the top of the world and discovered that coming back down is the hardest part. Sound cue. Heartbeat sound. Slow. Fading. Then silence. Some say his body still rests up there, frozen in time, looking out toward the horizon, as if watching over those who come after. Others say his spirit roams the ridges of K2, warning anyone who dares. The mountain doesn't care about courage. It doesn't care about dreams. It only waits. Because K2 is not a mountain you climb, it's a deal you make. And Alan Rouse paid in full. Music builds, low strings, dramatic, emotional crescendo. This was K2 Stories, the last climb of Alan Rouse, the tale of a man who reached the edge of human endurance and left behind a legacy carved into the ice. If this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, another climber is preparing for their own K2, and maybe, just maybe, they'll remember Alan before they take that first step.